Welcome again to Coastal Matters. This is a monthly program produced by the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy in association with Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charlie Walters. In 2003, Sarah Oktay became the managing director of UMass Boston's Nantucket Field Station, and in 2013 she became its director. She served on the Nantucket Conservation Commission from 2006 until 2015, including several years as vice chair. She is a former chair of the island's Harbor Plan Implementation Committee and Coastal Management Work Group, and a past president of the Nantucket Civic League. She currently serves as president of the Organization of Biological Field Stations. She holds a doctorate in chemical oceanography and has received numerous awards and fellowships over the years. And all of that represents only the tip of the iceberg of her accomplishments. Thank you for coming on, Sarah.
Thank you, Charlie, for having me.
I have to start this discussion with this question. How does someone who grew up in one of the most landlocked parts of North America become a chemical oceanographer?
Well, I come from a long family of petroleum geochemists, and in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I took an oceanography class in junior college. And I was so fascinated with the subject. At that time, I really wanted to be an astronaut, but knew my eyesight and my inability to put up with some authoritarian rules might thwart that. So when I started learning about oceanography, it was so fascinating because so little is known about the ocean, and it played to my strengths of chemistry and learning about fluid dynamics and water. And so I decided there and then to become an oceanographer.
Now tell us about some of the projects you were involved in before you came to Nantucket.
Well, my thesis work was on radioactive iodine. As an undergrad, I did a lot of work with trace metals and trace metal chemistry in harbors. So Galveston Bay and Padre Island and Houston Ship Channel, areas like that. I worked on looking at the trace metal pollution that came from human beings. When I moved on to my PhD, I looked at radioactive iodine around the world. So I ran around the world testing rivers, looking at the ratio of radioactive iodine that comes in naturally versus what we've put into the atmosphere from nuclear bombs.
So what sorts of places were you in around the
Well,
world?
almost every major river in the United States. And then I got samples out of China, and I did a little bit of teaching in China and out of Russia and India and a few other locations to look at terrestrial impacts of radiation around the world, and basically using these methods to trace organic carbon. So all of this research was based on climate change and seeing where the carbon has been introduced and find a way to trace it.
Let me step back for a second. If I understood you, a trace metal or trace metals you will find anywhere, even if there's no pollution or whatever.
Right,
they're always going to be there.
Right.
It's a question of how much will be there and what kinds of trace metals will be there.
Exactly, and that's the same for radionuclides. Most radionuclides are present naturally. There's a few that come in cosmogenically from the sun, and then there's a few that we introduce through either nuclear power or nuclear weapons. So both trace metals and radionuclides and many elements in our natural world are there naturally, but there's times when anthropogenically, or when humans introduce them. And so if you can tell the difference between the two or measure the difference, you can see where humans have had an impact.
Let's jump ahead to Nantucket. How did you happen to come here?
I was at the University of Massachusetts Boston and what was called then the Earth and Environmental Ocean Science Department. And my job as a postdoc was to make everything better for the department and do a variety of things, from working with different instrumentations to running their newsletter, alumni relationships, mentoring grad students. I had several grad students I mentored, and I ran a lab. One of my default positions was just to go to a committee meeting for my boss to learn about Nantucket. And so I was sitting in this committee talking about ways that we could better use the field station. And at that time I was making relationships with other departments across the university. And when the job description came up and the job was offered to the general public, basically, I applied and was fortunate because I had a varied background that they chose me to be the new director.
Well, it sounds as though when you got to UMass, you were doing a lot less field work than you'd been doing prior to that.
Yeah, I did do a couple of cruises, but I was helping the whole department, so I had to be a Jill of all trades and run, inductively couple plasma mass spec one day and then work on a website the next day. So a lot of that training really helped me be a good field station director, because a good field station director has to be able to do everything from fixing a toilet to talking to a senator to doing their own research.
And what goes on at the UMass Field Station here?
We have a lot of things going on. We have year-round classes for college students. We have a very healthy K-12 program with junior rangers during the summer. And then I work with students throughout the year on the science fair projects and different kinds of research for kids that are in high school and middle school. In fact, later today I'll go work with a couple of students that are in fifth grade to do some science. We also do a lot of water quality science, and I act with my 40 beds as a home base for scientists all over the world. So part of my job is actually to operate, in effect, B&B for other scientists. You know, provide them transportation, lab equipment, microscopes, refrigerators, a clean area to work, and a bed to lay their head on at night. So we have students, researchers coming from Purdue, from University of Massachusetts, of course, from all over New England and from around the world.
Are you getting to do more field work here than you were doing in Boston?
About the same. I do get to do more field work here, but it's because I don't have as much help as I'd like. So if I had more help, I'd probably do less field work. Though I do like being out in the ocean. It's nice in summer. It's a little harder in the end of November when I was collecting water samples out in the harbor for the state. It's a nice day. It's a great time to be a field researcher. If it's 20 below, it's not so entertaining.
So what do you find down here in your research?
Most of the work I do here is on nitrate and phosphate in the harbors, salt marshes, groundwater, and in some of the various small, streams and creeks that we have. So I'm looking at gross pollution, also anthropogenically, supplied by humans, but more along the lines of what comes from our septics and our fertilizer. I've also been working with Water Defense and Mark Ruffalo, and we've been having different environmental samplers that are out collecting all kinds of organic contaminants that might come from gasoline or from oil spills or just from different pesticides, for instance. The latest big project I've been doing for the state is looking at pesticides and different pharmaceuticals in the harbor.
How does Nantucket's shoreline, water quality and so on differ from other places, and how is it not differ from other places?
Well, it's some of the
I know
cleanest.
that's a big question.
Yeah, no, and that's a very good question. For industrial waste, we're in great shape. We get very little chemical input except atmospherically, so we're not right offshore from New Jersey or worrying about 200 years worth of tanning or paper mill waste, things that really impact most of the rest of New England. So I would never use the word pristine, but we're relatively clean as far as industrial waste. Where we're not so clean in is the simple human waste. Going back thousands of years back to the Wampanoags, and certainly with our population now, we've got relatively small watersheds, and so we can measure nitrate from human waste, and we can measure phosphate and different constituents of fertilizers, certainly in our harbor, in our salt marshes, and our groundwater. So some of the more what I would call gross wastes, which are simpler and easier to control, typically from fertilizer runoff and from septics, we have still less than the mainland, but we're not at zero.
Now, how far back do the records go at UMass? Can you compare what you found this year, say, with what 1930 might have been?
Not that far back. No, unfortunately, the first, the UMass Boston Nantucket Field Station was created in the 60s, in 1963. There was a little bit of water quality research in the 70s and 80s, but not a whole lot. Interestingly enough, New England has less water quality research underway historically than other parts of the country.
And why is that?
I don't know. It's a good question. Certainly in Galveston Bay, there's numbers that go back farther. In the Great Lakes, there's some areas where there's other information. Some of it's based on how long a field station has had a chemist or someone that cares about water quality working with them. When I go out to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in a few months, they go all the way back to 1928, and they, because of the mining industry, have been looking at metals, for instance, for a lot longer.
Well, now, if the field station came along in the 60s, was anybody doing any research along these lines prior to that time?
A few in the 80s and 90s, but more so on the Cape. There's more people at Woods Hole and at UMass Dartmouth than there was here at the field station. I think there was a couple of records going back to the 90s and the 2000s before I got here.
But there weren't any amateurs out there who were taking water samples
For the
and
town,
hanging on to them?
Yeah, there's
or
a
even,
few.
even privately?
Not really. No, there was a few. The town biologists have been taking water quality samples on and off. I think they did it once or twice in the 80s, once or twice in the 90s. There's a fairly large document created by UMass Dartmouth that came out, I think, in 1997. But prior to like early 90s, 93, not a whole lot done on the island.
Now, in your 13 years here, what do you see as the most difficult challenges facing Nantucket's shoreline?
Probably overdevelopment. I think we've got a lot of protections in place. I think the limitation on dock and piers is really helpful. I think the conservation space that's being set aside, especially what the land bank is doing, is helping. I think everyone upgrading their septic systems in the first zone is extremely important for the island. So we are now taking our cesspools offline, and this is especially important in Nantucket. Nantucket has a lot of cesspools and septic systems, which are just gravel beds that are, basically underwater. All of these problems are made worse through sea level rise. And so I would say sea level rise, coastal storms are a big problem for Nantucket, and they're just going to get worse. So that's one of the reasons I was spent some time helping with the coastal management plan, is to have a plan now when we're not panicking on how we're going to protect infrastructure as these storms cause more and more damage.
Talk some more about that coastal management plan.
Yeah, and it's a very special and important for the fuel station too, because I have a dorm that's at 34 feet from an eroding bluff, so I have to do the same kind.
As we speak.
Yeah, as we speak.
May not
so
be that in a couple of months.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm having to plan ahead for either moving it or augmenting the bluff or finding some ways to deal with this. But the coastal management plan was designed for the town as a municipality to look at all town-owned infrastructure and public access and have a plan for each and every one of those, so that as sea level rose and we had bigger storms, we had a contingency plan for how we would either fight that, work with that, abate it, or pull back. And those are all ways to address a coastal hazard. Is you can try to put up, a defense and hold your ground. You can retreat. You can work with it and kind of do a slow retreat, or you can adapt and go up, for instance. And that's what's done around the country, is people deal with all of these in 4 or 5 different ways.
Now, the coastal management plan deals with how much of the island?
The whole island, but only the municipal parts, only what the town owns.
Which is a minority of
Yeah,
a
we're
small
only talking
percentage
probably, 10% or less of the island. Part of the thing that's difficult to understand is, since it's a municipal plan, the town can't necessarily tell people what to do with private property. There could be a island-wide plan, but it would have to be voted on by the taxpayers, and it would have to be something that everyone's willing to sign off on. And for the state of Massachusetts, then, there's a lot of different decisions on legal rights and zoning and what you can or cannot tell people that they can do. It's an interesting problem. It goes way back to the 1600s and how they deeded the rights of the intertidal area to different folks around the world.
Well, let's have some details about that, because this is something everybody is confused about. Is
It's
it the
complicated.
low water line, the high water line?
It
Neither?
depends on who technically, homeowner owns all the way down to the low water line. But if you have your fishing, fouling, or navigating, you have access to their property between the high tide and the low tide. So if you're carrying binoculars, a gun, or a fishing pole, you can walk there.
You
That doesn't
have
mean
access.
You have access. That doesn't mean you
Access.
own it.
Yes.
Everything below the low water line belongs to the citizens of the state. And so you can't do something below the low tide that's going to impact the rest of your citizens, because that's not your property. So that's something that you have to do for the common good.
Well, now below the low water line, you're talking about being in the water
Like breakwaters.
most of the time.
Yeah. Or
But if you have an extreme low tide, how do you
that would
treat
be
that?
your mean low tide.
Mean
So if
low
you
tide,
have an
okay.
extreme low tide, you could be impacting. And I think it's really important to remember that this is everyone's, land. That's actually a very important protection that the state of Massachusetts built into their laws and their constitution in some ways. So you have to really respect those different boundaries. So you could end up taking away someone else's property if you did something that affected below the low water line, or you could affect the whole Commonwealth's, everyone's property.
With sea level rise, that low water mark is going to be changing.
That will be changing, yeah.
Maybe year to year, noticeably.
Yeah, and I don't know how often. I know that the state goes around and reestablishes what the average mean low water mark is regularly, but I don't think they do it as often as yearly. I think it's probably more like 5 to 10 years. I think they're going to have to be more responsive with sea level rise. And there's all kinds of, and I'm not the best person to talk to, but there's all kinds of cool legal ramifications for if you acquire sand or you lose sand. Most of the time when you lose the sand, you know, that's now the state's land. If your property is underwater, it's no longer your property. But if you keep that property and it becomes above water, then you reacquire it.
Well, now when you say sand, if there's additional sand someplace, does that include humanly provided additional sand or just naturally?
I think it includes humanly provided, but that's a good question for, actually there's an excellent legal program through UMass Boston, through the School for the Environment, and we have an entire master's program that addresses all of these questions for maritime law. It's probably one of the more exciting things that students can learn about.
A couple of years ago, FEMA redrew its floodplain lines, if that's the right term.
It's exactly right, yep.
And my understanding at the time was that they changed them because the old line didn't take into account wave action.
Exactly, yeah. Or
But-
surge, either one.
Well, right. Now, but that would seem to mean that they also did not take into account sea level rise.
Exactly, no.
So is there going to have to be another FEMA plan very quickly?
I would say probably every 5 years or 10 years, and that interval might get squashed into a shorter interval if sea level rise proceeds like it is right now, quickly. So, you know, you could have a plan to readdress it every 5 years, and then you might find out that that's not enough.
They're going to start redoing the jetties in, I guess, March of next year or
I think
summer
so.
of next year?
Yep.
Presumably that will increase the flow of water going in and out of the harbor because it won't be spilling over the jetty.
Yes, change
Will
in a
that
small
happen? And
percentage,
what does
yeah.
that mean? What will that do to change the harbor beaches and so on?
It's not going to be something that you could really observe unless you're paying very close attention and doing like profiling under the water or doing seafloor mapping like I'm doing with Mark Borelli and the seafloor mapping program at the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown. It's not something where you could look out and go, oh my God, everything's all exposed, or I can obviously see the current moving faster. It's going to be a small percentage change.
But is that enough to make a change in say,
It's going to help. What's interesting,
scalloping or whatever?
what is going to help the most is right now we're at about 0.350 milligrams per liter of nitrate. Nitrogen is nitrate. We're right at the level where we're always in the verge of being in trouble. I do like the way Brian Howes explains it. He says, you know, you've got a cup of coffee and it's filled to the very top. If you just put a couple more drops in it, it's going to overflow. That's how we are on nitrogen for the harbor. And that level, that tipping point is so close that we can have algal blooms, we can have the, it's not quite Lingbia, but the excess macroalgae that we've had that have showed up. So we're right on the verge of being in trouble all the time. So even if we clean out 4 or 5% of the nitrogen, that's going to be enough to give us some breathing space. So it's equivalent of having your bank account being within $10 of being out of money. This is making your bank account have $25, not $2,000. So we've got a little bit more breathing room, enough to get a little bit more, gasoline in our tank.
Is there sufficient enforcement for some of the things you're talking about, like nitrates in the harbor, just to use one
We're
example?
working hard on it. We're trying to release the blue pages right now. A lot of it is, voluntary, and getting people to understand that if they don't police themselves by pumping out their septic systems or following the best management practices of the fertilizer plant, they're only hurting themselves. They're hurting your property values, you're hurting your ability to swim in the harbor, you're hurting your ability to have scallops. So most of the things that we're doing now are basically voluntary, though with the best management practices, you do have to have a licensed fertilizer applicator who has signed off on the plan applying material. You're not allowed to put phosphate onto your lawn unless you can prove you need it. But with all things, there's not someone running around taking soil samples and giving you a ticket for having too much phosphate on your, most of we're having to be big people and do it ourselves.
You say that we won't be able to see the increased flow of water when the jetties are built.
Yeah.
But will the increased flow be enough to affect erosion in the harbor? Any more than sea level rise already is?
I don't think so. I don't think it'll be measurable. What you would do is put an acoustic current Doppler profiler, and you might see turbidity rise by 2 or 3%. I think our storms you would say is the storm signal would way override what's happening with the jetties. In the case of the jetties, I think it's just as important to raise them for safety, navigation reasons. It will help some. It's more than a Band-Aid, but it's certainly not a salvation. And it's not going to cause, I wouldn't worry about erosion going up.
What would be the salvation, or is that within our power to affect things?
To turn back the clock and have us build even more sewers than 100 years ago. The salvation, I think, is what people are doing now. If everyone stopped fertilizing or fertilized way less, whether it's organic or not, and if everyone got their septic systems pumped out yearly, that would make a big difference. Two relatively inexpensive things that would involve homeowners spending less money. Especially if homeowners decided, I like having a funky yard. It doesn't always have to be emerald green. My field station, I don't fertilize, and it's 100 acres, and it always looks great to me.
It always looks great to me.
Yeah. So there's things that you can, and certainly pumping out your septic system makes sense, because if you don't pump it out, you're the first person to pay the piper if it backs up, for instance. So that's a simple and relatively inexpensive thing to do. So there's some, we don't have to put in, it is good to put in sewer systems, because that's one way to take all that, pollution out of the equation and treat it appropriately. And I think the town's actually, by upgrading the sewer treatment plants, I think the town's been pretty proactive on those. But yeah, those are the two ways you can, bring Nantucket back to how it was maybe 400 or 500 years ago.
Let's move out of the harbor and talk about the rest of the Nantucket coastline. What are the big issues there? What have you seen in your 13 years here?
Yeah, and the biggest issues are erosion. Nantucket, just as all islands, and certainly barrier islands, same with Galveston Island, any kind, areas off of North Carolina, Nantucket's eroding where the heavier waves are, where the ocean-facing beaches are, and is what we call rolling back toward, in this case, the mothership, which is the Cape. So Nantucket is eroding from the southern eastern side and moving slightly north and to the west as it ages. Tuckernuck's moving closer to the mainland, as is Muskeget. And I think Muskeget's moved about 3/4 of a mile, Tuckernuck maybe 1/4 of a mile. So that's all ocean-facing beaches do that. They want to roll over where they will erode on the ocean side and fill in on the lee. And that makes sense for any island will do that. So Nantucket's erosion rates are some of the highest in the country, 13 to 15 feet per year on the eastern shore, on the Nantucket shore, and 10 to 12 feet per year in some parts of the eastern shore. And in some parts of the harbor, it used to be 1/2 foot a year, and in some parts, like at the field station, we've accelerated to 6 to 7 feet per year in the last couple of years.
So what does one do or not do about this?
There's a variety of things you can do. The best way is to move your property. That's the
Move structures.
Move structures. That's the easy. You can revegetate it. You can do what's called different soft solutions. Soft solutions are everything from bringing in sand and vegetating it, rebuilding the beach, rebuilding a dune. That's what's working really well in New Jersey. Areas that had rebuilt dunes survived sanding much better than areas that didn't have that. You can put what's called living shorelines, anything from a salt marsh. A salt marsh absorbs every foot, within a mile of a salt marsh, it absorbs over a foot worth of wave action. So salt marshes can make a huge difference to what gets impacted inland. And then you can do bigger and bigger structures, which we might even have to do at the field station, where you've got core bags or jute bags full of sand planted with fencing in front of it. You can go up the gradient and do everything. Well, now you can't really do this, but back in the past, you would do seawalls, revetments, groins, gabions, all that kind of stuff, which are hard structures. So there's a continuum from doing nothing, doing a little, replanting dunes, core bags, hybrid systems, to full-on seawalls.
And what you might want to do on, say, Surfside is not what you might want to do on in Dionys or whatever.
Right.
There's a different approach to every part of the island.
Exactly. Some place that has very low wave action can have a couple of core bags stacked up with vegetation, and it'll hold up well. You wouldn't want to put something that's designed to be in the middle, at the end of Logan, in front of Dionys. I mean, you're going to want to, and the softer the solution, the better it absorbs the wave impact. That's one thing people don't quite understand. I think people get it when we went from having big metal cars, you know, that were 100% metal. When you hit a tree, the car completely crumpled in and typically you died. Now we have softer cars that have crumple zones that are designed to take that impact so you don't take the impact. And that works the same for a coastal erosion structure. The softer it is, the more variegated it is, the waves hit it in a way that dissipates the energy. If you've got something hard, the waves are going to hit it hard, and they can be deflected up, around, over. So anyone that studies physics or wave action, it makes sense. If you put a rock in the surf zone and just leave it sitting there, you're going to get a hole around that rock in 2 or 3, waves. If you put a little pile of sand and stick a bunch of little pieces of beach grass in it, it's going to hold up to that, and it's not going to eat away around it.
Briefly, pond openings on Nantucket. Good idea, bad idea?
It's mixed. It depends on the nature of the pond. So I'm for pond openings on Sacajah. I'm absolutely not for it on Hummock Pond. The Wampanoags used to do a lot of things. Not all of them were fantastic. So Sacajah is basically that's the big, large, Great Salt Pond that's on the eastern side of the island. It's basically a harbor that ended up with a barrier beach that sealed it off. And so it was opened naturally by wave action. And it's evolved to be a salt pond. So the creatures that live in there, some of which are catadromous or anadromous and go back and forth to the ocean, are fine with having salinity in there. And I've been studying Sacajah with a bunch of very young students for about 8 years now. And it goes from 8 to 15 parts per thousand. It used to have tons of oysters. It still has some. So it's a salt, brackish environment. Hummock Pond is a long, skinny finger lake created by the glaciers that was opened probably rarely by the ocean, maybe a couple of times, but mainly by Wampanoags and then colonists and us. It is a freshwater pond that has salt water being forced upon it. And so the creatures that are in the pond do not dig being exposed to ocean water. And when you release the hydraulic pressure on that pond, all of the stacked septic systems and all the groundwater flows into the pond. And so I think it actually makes and several other groundwater specialists agree with me, or have the same theory, let's say that it reduces that hydraulic head and allows fertilizers and the septic systems to run into the pond faster. So it is one way to flush the pond, but it's not like you've got an impermeable membrane there holding back all the poop while you flush the pond, and then you fill the pond with fresh water. It's that poop flows straight in there.
Or it solves one problem, but exacerbates another one. So,
yeah. It does, and you can tell with the health of Hummock Pond, it's always being stressed. So it's adding unnecessary stress to that ecosystem. It doesn't fit the ecosystem. And even more so for Maya Comet. That's why they no longer open Maya Comet.
We just have a minute left, but you're about to leave Nantucket, and I want you to tell us about where you're going and what you'll be doing there.
I'll be going to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab.
Another landlocked
area. Another closer to my home, closer to Oklahoma, but up 9,000 feet, which I don't think that necessarily says anything about sea level rise, but I think I'll be pretty safe. So if we're in trouble there, then Nantucket's long in trouble. I'll be helping with fundraising and with communications in a lab and in a field station that's existed since the late 20s. So it's one of the biggest field stations in the world. And it's one where I'll have a big team to work with. More groundwater research and hydrology. I'll be doing some Department of Energy work, a little bit more work with Water Defense and Mark Ruffalo, looking at contamination around the world. But mainly my job will be hopefully to become better at talking about science to just everyday people, and getting them excited in what we can do and what we can't do and what kind of changes we can make, and helping people understand how to deal with or learn more about climate change.
We're going to miss you here, but this sounds really exciting.
I am really excited about this opportunity. It's been one that the director for this field station has been dogging me for a couple of years to, as have many other field stations around the world, to go work in different locations. So I'll really miss the people of Nantucket, and I love the harbor and the salt marsh. But I think I've done, you know, as much as I think I can do here, and I'm excited for our field station. We're putting $650,000 into a new lab. We're getting ready to put another $350,000 into the dorm. We're bringing in, hopefully, a new director that will be even more fantastic. So I'm positive for the people of Nantucket. I think they've got it under control.
Sarah Oktay, thank you for joining me. This has been fascinating.
Thank you, Charlie. I could talk to you all day.
And good luck in Colorado.
Thank you.
For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thank you for tuning in. Please tune in again next time.